Why isn't there a Swiss cowboy or a German cattleman? It sounds like a joke, but it's actually one of the most revealing questions you can ask about history. There are cattle in Switzerland, there are cattle in the Netherlands, and there are cattle in Germany. Half of Europe has been raising oxen and cows for millennia, but the cowboy, that horseman who tamed the Americas, was born in only one place, the Iberian Peninsula. And the reason why the Spanish and Portuguese developed a system of ranches and cattle management on horseback involves history, geography, geopolitics, and a fascinating cultural development, which would make the culture of cattle and cowboys present in many different forms, from the Argentine pampas all the way to the northern United States. In today's video, we're going to talk about the rise of the cowboy and how it is closely related to Iberian culture. To understand the history of cattle in the Iberian Peninsula, we first need to understand the phenomenon of ranches in the history of the territory. Cattle have been present in that region for a long time. Even before the Romans arrived in the peninsula, the Celts and the Iberians were already raising cattle and even sculpting them, as seen in the iconic bulls of Guisando. But as time went by, cattle raising took on new forms. With the expansion of war and the Reconquista, many properties were simply left empty on the frontiers with the Moors. To prevent this, the kings granted these lands to religious orders and nobles so they could establish farms there. The farms were called that because things were made there. They produced goods, and one of the animals that adapted perfectly to this model was cattle. And this is exactly where geography comes into play. In Northern Europe, with a larger amount of pasture and very fertile regions with abundant grazing land, herding was done on foot, just like with sheep. That's because the cattle didn't need to be very mobile, often staying concentrated in certain areas with abundant grass pasture. But on the Iberian Peninsula, the reality was scarce pasture and large herds of cattle, with vast regions having little grass. Thus, for cattle raising, they had to travel long distances, making it impossible to try to control the cattle on foot. In this way, the need arose for a man, the cowboy, to be mounted on horseback to manage the cattle and prevent them from scattering. But cattle were not just food, they were also power. Cattle could not be raised scattered along the roads, since they also became a tool of war in the dangerous border areas. Both the Moors and the Christians carried out raids, which were surprise attacks in enemy territory. And the targets included both people to enslave and cattle to steal. So the Spaniards, to protect themselves from these attacks, developed the system of ranches. In this system, the cattle could travel long distances in a controlled area without being exposed to the dangers of enemy raids. And in Extremadura, the figure of the Caballero Villon emerged, who drove the cattle both through communal lands and through the ranches. And they could also have military importance, often being summoned and paid as horsemen in the wars against the Moors because of their skill on horseback. After all, a person who could drive dozens or hundreds of cattle with a whip could also be a great asset in times of war. And this ranch system would later cross the ocean, being brought by. Cattle have always been very present on the Iberian Peninsula, and the bull was the main entertainment for many Castilian kings. Since the Visigoths, like Sigismund, kings enjoyed bullfights. Pedro the Cruel never missed them for anything, and Isabella of Castile tried to create laws to cover the bull's horns to prevent injuries to the bullfighters. Carlos I even lassoed a bull in 1527 during the celebrations for the birth of his son, Felipe II. The bull was a true symbol of the Iberian Peninsula. It's no wonder that when the Catholic monarchs conquered the Emirate of Granada, the Pope ordered bullfights to be held in Rome in honor of the kings. In this way, he held a Spanish celebration in Rome to honor those who ended the last Moorish stronghold on the peninsula. And in Portugal, cattle handling was not only part of the farms, but also of royalty. Around 1680, it was not uncommon. Bullfights at Terreiro do Pacho. Kings like Dom Manuel promoted bullfights at the site, and others, like Dom Sebastião and Afonso VI, even became real bullfighters. In fact, Dom Sebastião asked Pope Gregory to revoke the bull that prohibited bullfights. Bullfights and bull runs were part of the popular entertainment for the Portuguese people. Joana Vasconcelos de Pina reports in her article that, from nobles to the poor, Portuguese society enjoyed going to watch the bulls, where they could see the fierce bulls being led to the arenas up close. Not to mention the bull runs, where the animals were released among the people. Dealing with these fierce animals was a practice that involved a display of courage. In her article, she reports that a criminal named João Camarão had his sentence reduced for facing a bull. And King Pedro II even went so far as to face a bull on foot, instead of bullfighting on horseback like the others. Naturally, the Portuguese and Spanish brought this pastoral tradition to the Americas. And in this way, the culture of farms, ranches, and cowboys developed on a large scale in Spanish and Portuguese America. In America, the hot climate and the vastness of the territory, and in some places, the very similarity to the Iberian Peninsula, made this process easier. But in America, there were no horses, so the Portuguese and Spanish had to bring them from Europe. The Spanish, in particular, used horses a lot during the conquest, giving them a clear advantage in war. In fact, many natives, having never seen a horse before, believed that the rider and the horse were one being, like a centaur. And the advantage of the horse soon led the Spanish to breed the animal on a large scale, causing many to simply escape and breed in the wild since they had no predators and plenty of food. In this way, the runaway horses that became wild were called mestenios, which the English, upon hearing, would eventually call mustang. In this way, the mustangs are the wild Spanish horses that inspired the famous car brand that has this horse as its symbol. The Iberians also shaped the culture around the animal. With large tournaments, among them the vacajada and the rodeo, these tournaments served especially to demonstrate the skill of the cowboys and charros in lassoing cattle and handling livestock. And what's interesting is that this culture spread throughout the Americas, adapting to each region, but always maintaining one characteristic in common. The Spanish created the culture of the Mexican charros. In the Pampas, the figure of the Gaucho emerges, while in Portuguese America there is the figure of the northeastern cowboy. In the Northeast, with their leather jackets adapted to the heat and arid climate, as well as in the Southeast, the tropeiros emerge, who influence the caipira culture, so widespread throughout the interior of Brazil by the bandeirantes. But the Gauchos are perhaps the most interesting example of this dynamic, because they are precisely the perfect intersection between Portuguese tropeiro culture and Spanish culture. However, nowadays, when many people see things related to rodeos, instead of associating them with Iberians, like the Spanish and Portuguese, they associate them with the United States. And this is largely due to American marketing and cinema, which specifically aim to erase the Iberian influence from this important culture. After the war with Mexico and the incorporation of almost half of the Mexican territory into the United States, the Americans found themselves facing an already existing culture involving extensive cattle ranching, tournaments, and horse handling. In this way, the media began to fabricate the myth of the Old West, which would be an inhospitable, uninhabited land where only savages lived, and which would now become the stage for thieves, outsiders, and adventurers seeking to civilize the region and make money. And the media will help popularize this as merely a conflict between the English and the indigenous people. Or characters like Buffalo Bill, Chief Sitting Bull, or Billy the Kid with stories about gunfights and adventures, with the entire Iberian cowboy culture as a backdrop, which was brought by the Spanish and had been present there for hundreds of years before, but without making any reference to the Iberians in relation to this. It's no wonder that for many, the cowboy culture is seen as something purely American, even though it's a raw adaptation of all the Spanish origins. The very terms rodeo in American, it's rodeo or ranch, are Spanish ranchos that are merely adapted. In this way, before any brave American cowboy from the movies, there were already men on horseback, facing danger, the sun, the dust, and the risk, guiding the cattle through harsh and unpredictable lands. They were Spaniards and Portuguese who, since the Reconquista in the Middle Ages, operated on the frontier, surviving through cattle, and who would take this art to become one of the most admired and beloved pillars of all Ibero-American culture. And did you know about the history of the Cowboys, Charros, and Gauchos? What surprised you the most? So, leave your comment right now to support our work and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel. That way you'll have access. And don't forget to leave your like and share, so you can not only support our work, but also dive deeper and get to know Iberica even more.